So if you were here last month, we were mainly covering the late 1980s with Max Ward finally able to achieve his dream of operating a regularly scheduled carrier, and then running into huge difficulties after the purchase of new Airbuses, basically to round out his fleet. Not enough business travelers ended up switching to Ward Air, so Max ended up having to very reluctantly sell Ward Air to PWA Corp, which was the parent company of Canadian Airlines, which had, of course, become out of a merger of Pacific Western Airlines and Canadian Pacific Airlines. So Canadian Airlines had its headquarters in Alberta, unfortunately in Calgary, not Edmonton, but it, because of the merger of essentially these three major airlines, became a very large airline in its own right. So they had their headquarters in Calgary and then major hubs in the three major Canadian cities, so Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And they thought that buying Ward Air was going to be essentially the final piece of their puzzle, giving them access to European markets like London, Paris, and Frankfurt that they'd previously been excluded from. And after the takeover, the government opened up additional charter carriers, or opened up opportunities for additional charter carriers to promote competition. So that obviously bid into their operations. And of course, Canadian Airlines is no longer around. I found this image. It's actually from the Microsoft Flight Simulator. So it's somebody's modern interpretation of what Canadian Airlines livery might look like today on a modern Airbus. So for those of you that play Flight Simulator, you can look it up by searching for Tony Kretzel. So we're going to focus on just a little bit, finishing off kind of the major Canadian Airlines, well, specifically Canadian Airlines, and then we'll get into the debate over the closure of the Municipal Airport. So Canadian Airlines was hit, as was most of the airline industry, by the 1990 to 1991 recession, which was made worse by the Gulf War. Essentially, low passenger demand, which was coming out of the recession, and higher fuel prices were particularly to blame. And the 1991 slump hit Canadian Airlines pretty hard. So they ended up with about $700 million in debt because of it, and they had to go through some pretty major restructuring in order to reconfigure their operations and their company. But as I said, they weren't the only ones hit. Globally, airline losses peaked in 1992 at $6.5 billion Canadian. So it was a pretty rough year for airlines in general. Because of this, Canadian ended up getting a large injection of money from American Airlines, who at the time owned about 33% of the shares in Canadian and had 25% of the voting rights for Canadian Airlines International. And it took at least a full year after the war ended, after the Gulf War ended, for traffic volumes to pick up and get back to their pre-Gulf War levels. And that's kind of a pretty common thing that happens with crises that affect airlines, be it the Gulf War, oil crisis, the Asian economic crisis, 9/11. Of course, probably the worst one that we've experienced is COVID, because it's been dragging on for quite some time. So as I said, in 1997 and 1998 was the Asian economic crisis that hit, which destabilized the Asian economy, and then spread rapidly worldwide and destabilized a lot of the world's economy by the end of the late 1990s. And it really started basically in Thailand, because Thailand unpegged their currency, which is the Thai baht. It had been pegged to the US dollar, so they unpegged it and let it ride on the market. And that set off a series of currency devaluations throughout Asia. So the Indonesian currency devalued by about 80%, the Thai currency by 50%, South Korea by 50%, and Malaysia by 45%. And this had a huge effect on the Pacific market for Canadian Airlines and others. And of course, the Pacific market was a huge piece of Canadian Airlines operations. So they were very heavily depending on the Asian market at the time. They had a large hub built in Vancouver to serve that, and it really dried up that business to Asia. And I said before, these crises are not terribly uncommon, and you can see that after a slump, there's a general, not a general, but like a significantly bigger increase after a slump. So for those airlines that are able to weather these storms, they often bounce back and do fairly well. However, Canadians' domestic share was also about to take a huge hit in the middle of the 1990s, unrelated to this. And that was a new airline that came in, which was founded in June of 1994 by Clive Beddoe, David Needleman, Mark Hill, Tim Morgan, and Donald Bell. And of course, I'm sure we all are very familiar with WestJet. And the concept for WestJet was based on, it was not a particularly new idea at the time. It was based on pre-existing concepts that had been pioneered by others like Southwest Airlines in the United States and Morris Air. And it pretty much became immediately successful. And as they built up their business, found more aircraft and more employees, WestJet took off very rapidly. So they first started with a used 727. And this is one of the first articles that I could find from 1995 explaining their business model. So a one-way flight at the time from Salt Lake City to Oakland on Southwest Airlines was about $39 to $94 US. And the cheapest flight from Saskatoon to Vancouver, about the same distance in Canada, was about $383. So there's this huge market for a discount airline that would bring much cheaper service to Canada. And of course, Ward Air had been offering a lot of discount flights internationally, and they just started with domestic service. But with the merger of Canadian, they weren't really a what's the word I'm looking for? Discount carrier. So WestJet came in and really filled that market. Canadian originally came out and they said, okay, we're going to match WestJet's prices, but they weren't really set up. Their business wasn't really set up enough to do that. So it really opened up a hole for WestJet to come in. And of course, WestJet came to the international airport, not the Municipal, because passenger service was to be consolidated at the international airport. The user fee was about $5.30 at the Municipal at the time, which is about $1,300 for a fully loaded 737 versus about $300 from the international. So even if they wanted to, it was significantly cheaper to operate from the international. And these are just a few advertisements from mid-90s when WestJet was just starting out. So initially they served Calgary, Edmonton, Kelowna, Vancouver, and Winnipeg, and then they added Regina, Saskatoon, and Victoria in 1996. And they went public in July of 1999 with an offering of 2.5 million shares at $10 a share, so valued at $25 million. And by then they'd expanded to Thunder Bay, Grand Prairie, and Prince George. Meanwhile, Air Canada had privatized after the Air Canada Public Participation Act in 1988. So the federal government sold 45% of its shares in Air Canada. They moved the headquarters to the Dorval Airport in Montreal. And in 1999, Air Canada put in a bid to take over Canadian Airlines International. So essentially, Canadians' international routes and their gates would be sold to Air Canada. They would just restructure Canadian as a domestic regional airline. That offer was rejected by Canadian Airlines, although it was supported by American Airlines, who of course had 25% of the votes on the board and 33% of the shares of Canadian at the time. And American Airlines was really lobbying the Canadian government hard to relax their regulations against foreign ownership of Canadian Airlines. So at the time, it was very heavily restricted that foreigners or foreign companies couldn't own Canadian-based airlines. So shortly after Canadian rejected this offer, Onyx Corp announced a competing bid, and that competing bid was very heavily backed by American Airlines. And so the Canadian Airlines board said, okay, we'll accept the offer. Air Canada came back and re-upped their bid, and their bid was backed by the Star Alliance partners. And then in this new bid, they said, okay, we're going to continue to operate Canadian Airlines as a separate, wholly separate airline, not merge it into Air Canada. The Onyx bid was then declared illegal by a judge in Quebec. So Canadian ended up going back to the table with Air Canada, and they finalized the deal in December of 1999. So with the takeover, Canadian Airlines was to be operated as a separate subsidiary through most of the next year. By late 2000, all of Canadian Airlines employees and systems have been fully integrated into the Air Canada systems. But Canadian was in essentially more of a worse financial position than Air Canada had realized when they put in that bid. So coupled with financial worries, pilot strikes, and some mismanagement, essentially caught up. And 2 months after the integration of the two airlines, Air Canada announced that they would cut 3,500 jobs, which was obviously a huge blow and disproportionately affected the Canadian Airlines employees, former Canadian employees. A year after that, about 2 weeks after September 11th, 2001, they cut another 5,000 jobs. And that essentially marked the death knell for Air Canada's promises to operate Canadian as a separate carrier. So Canadian was fully merged into Air Canada. And this picture shows a hybrid livery of essentially Canadian Airlines / Air Canada 747 at the time. So of course, it took about 6 years for airlines to recover capacity after the September 11th terrorist attacks. So before the current COVID crisis, this was the steepest decline in airline traffic. Immediately after 9/11, travel demands in the United States for air travel fell by more than 30%. So it affected, of course, American Airlines, Canadian Airlines, and airlines worldwide. There was about 62,000 airline jobs lost in the United States, which is 11% of their total employment at the time. Of the airline industry's total employment at the time. And it led to a lot of restructuring of various carriers and airlines immediately after that. So more and more budget carriers came out of it. A lot of fleets and old aircraft were sold off to budget airlines. It's going to be interesting to see exactly what happens with the COVID crisis, which obviously isn't over yet. But I can see some pretty major changes coming in lieu of the last 3 years of craziness. Of course, this animation is showing the airspace over the United States during 9/11. So if you've seen the musical, which I'm just blanking on the name right now, Come From Away, Far From Away, about the efforts of people in Gander, Newfoundland to rehome a lot of these people that landed in Newfoundland. Just recently was here. So when Air Canada took over Canadian Airlines, they became the 10th largest airline in the world. But they took on a huge amount of debt. They had $8 billion of debt when they took over Canadian Airlines. There was a lot of bad feelings, especially a lot of employees that had been, part of Pacific Western or Canadian Pacific or Ward Air that had to migrate to Canadian Airlines and then had to migrate to Air Canada. And so it was a pretty turbulent time for, airlines in general, but especially those employees. By December of 2001, the stock market, so before 9/11, the stock market was down, the dot-com boom was going bust, and a lot of airlines were bleeding customers. So it hit a lot of airlines pretty hard. And as I said, most of the Air Canada losses ended up disproportionately affecting Canadian Airlines employees. With the growing power of WestJet at the same time, Air Canada's domestic traffic fell about 13%, and WestJet was up 52%. So that WestJet low-cost model was really taking over. So as a reaction to that, Air Canada started launching their own low-cost carriers. So Zip was launched in Calgary as a no-frill subsidiary in September 2002, essentially as a direct competition to WestJet. and it was helmed by Steve Smith, who was the former CEO of WestJet. 99 was the last year Air Canada turned a profit. So they took on Canadian Airlines, all of their aircraft, all 40,000 employees, and had just a massive problem integrating everything. Everything came to a head. They filed for bankruptcy protection in April of 2003. So pretty bad time for Air Canada. WestJet, on the other hand, of course, grew. And it being an Alberta company, generally, made for a fairly healthy airline industry here in Alberta. So with the collapse of Canadian Airlines and the downturn of Air Canada, WestJet started expanding east. So they started serving Hamilton and Ottawa, as well as Moncton, New Brunswick, with Hamilton as their eastern hub. So this is a map from 2000 with Hamilton, Ottawa, and Moncton added. 2003, they added Windsor, Montreal, Halifax, St. John's, and Gander. So they were now operating coast to coast. Also in 2003, they had a partnership agreement with to operate chartered flights to Mexico and the Caribbean, in partnership with Air Transat's tour operators. They started scheduled international service in 2004, and then moved their eastern hub to Toronto and started United States destinations. So during the 2000s, WestJet made very significant upwards in the domestic market share against Air Canada, as I said. So in 2000, they had only about 7% of the domestic share of airline travel in Canada. Air Canada had 77%. And 10 years later, or almost 10 years later, in 2009, WestJet had 38% of the market, and Air Canada had only 55%. So WestJet really expanded to fill that void. Of course, now there's a huge number of American destinations that WestJet serves. In 2013, they started flights to Europe, from Newfoundland to Dublin. And in 2015, they started nonstop service to London, including from Edmonton. So they went from this extremely small airline just servicing about 5 different, small towns and cities in the West to a major international airline. In 2017, or between 2017 and 2019, they split off their ultra low cost model and they created Swoop as a new subsidiary. So that started in the mid of 2018, with the WestJet brand being the kind of global carrier. Onyx Corporation, which of course had previously put in a bid for Canadian Airlines, then put in a bid in 2019 for WestJet. So Onyx purchased WestJet in 2019 for $5 billion. And at the time, WestJet had 13 737 MAX jets in suspended operation and another 57 on order. So the price of WestJet was actually pretty heavily slashed because of this. So all of the 737 MAX aircraft were grounded, and with that huge back order, it made the company less valuable on paper than it really is in reality. And of course, during the COVID pandemic, there's been huge layoffs, and time will tell exactly what's going to happen to WestJet, but they've laid off, I think, close to 10,000 employees over the last couple of years. So the airport debate. If you were online earlier today, you would have seen several hundred people discussing this very passionately. It's obviously an issue that a lot of people feel very passionate about. Either they grew up around the airport, they had businesses that relied on the airport, they were members of the Flying Club, the Air Museum. So this debate has been going on in Edmonton I guess it's still going on, but the debate really went on for about 50 years. But the debate about whether or not to close down Edmonton's Municipal Airport is not unique to Edmonton. There is a really similar debate over in Montreal over Dorval and Mirabel, or like Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Mirabel, and another debate in Toronto. So in Edmonton, the basically the region, like the growth of Edmonton and Calgary, the different ways that Edmonton and Calgary grew, really spurred the re-examination of the city center airport debate. So in both Montreal and Edmonton, it was often suggested that if flights could be consolidated into one airport, they would stop losing their market share to the competing aviation market. So Calgary was really growing heavily and really outpacing Edmonton. So a lot of that really drove the debate as to whether or not to close the municipal airport. Essentially, focus everything on the international, and then you wouldn't be splitting your efforts, and you could make the one airport much better than either one could be by themselves. So in about 1963, passenger movement in Edmonton and Calgary was pretty much equal. But since 1963, Calgary has grown has vastly outstripped Edmonton. And really that the split off started in the late 70s. So the two markets have really diverged since. So in 1963, Calgary inplaned and deplaned 425,000 people, which is about 15% greater than the combined total of 369,000 here in Edmonton. And by 2002, Calgary had handled 3.9 million passengers, which is more than double of what Edmonton was servicing. So a lot of the debate over whether or not to close the airport, the municipal airport, was to try to catch up to Calgary and get the international airport to compete with the Calgary airport. So in 1995, the city was put to a plebiscite as to whether or not to consolidate passenger service at the international airport. Supporters of the yes side for consolidation included, obviously, the Edmonton Regional Airport Authority, the Economic Development Edmonton, the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, McLeod Enterprises, Draco Energy Services, a lot of major economic organizations. The No campaign was much more of a grassroots campaign. So the Air Services of Tomorrow group was a grassroots group formed here at the municipal airport in 1992, essentially to champion the municipal airport. And it was led by Rick Coughlin, who was a lawyer and former member of 418 Squadron, and who worked for Airspray at the time. So obviously a lot of smaller companies, mainly smaller companies that use the municipal airport, really had a vested interest in keeping the municipal airport alive, as well as all of the businesses surrounding the airport that really, relied on that airport traffic to really drive business. So the Kingsway Business Association was also very heavily involved on the no side. So no wanting to keep the airport passenger service at the airport. So in Montreal, they have an airport in the middle of the city and an airport outside of the city, kind of like Edmonton. And so Mirabel was built as an attempt to consolidate all air traffic to a new airport. So from 1975 to 1997, all international flights to and from Montreal, except for flights to and from the States, were required to use Mirabel Airport. But Mirabel is pretty far away from the city. They didn't have a lot of transportation links to the city. And because they were still using domestic service from Dorval, made Mirabel particularly unattractive for travelers and for airlines. Montreal's economy also was in gradual decline during that time. So passenger levels never really achieved what they were hoping for at the new airport. And so when they finally made the decision to consolidate passenger service at one airport, they actually picked Dorval rather than Mirabel. So Mirabel became just a cargo airport and turned into be pretty much a white elephant. So Dorval was renamed for Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and they consolidated all traffic there. So it's kind of the opposite situation.
It's not on.
sorry, can you guys hear me?
I just turned on this news.
Yes, I don't know what that is.
Okay, I'm just going to mute everybody. Okay, anyway, so it's kind of the opposite situation from Edmonton. So rather than consolidate at the distant airport, they consolidated at the city center airport. Mirabel was huge. It's not just a small airport. It's the largest airport in the world that had ever been envisioned at the time, with a planned area of about 400 square kilometers. So it's this decision to kind of reconsolidate everything at Dorval rather than Mirabel was not undertaken lightly. In Toronto, the Toronto City Island Airport, or Billy Bishop Airport, was built in the 30s, and it was conceived as being the main airport for Toronto, with construction finishing in 1939. Malton Airport was built as an alternate, but Malton ended up becoming Toronto's main airline hub instead. So the city airport became really used for general aviation and a little bit of military use. So in the 40s and 50s, there was a movement to expand the city center airport, the Toronto City Airport, rather. They sold the Malton Airport to the Government of Canada in order to fund the expansion of the island airport. So there was over 200,000 flights per year in the 60s at the island airport. They started introducing regional airliners in the 1970s, but then overall numbers declined, and then they started bringing up the issue of closing the island airport. So in 1983, they signed a 50-year tripartite agreement with the Government of Canada. So the City of Toronto, between the Government of Canada, the City of Toronto, and the Toronto Harbour Commission, mainly to limit noise at the airport and ban jets for scheduled airlines. And of course, the issue of noise pollution and jets at city center airports exists pretty much at every city that has a airport close to it. But, by this time, you really need that jet service to make your airport viable as a passenger hub. In the 90s, the airport was losing money, so they brought back the issue of closing it. And so instead, in 1999, they formed the Toronto Port Authority with a new mandate to essentially make the Port of Toronto and the airport self-sufficient. So they needed to expand the airport. They worked with a new regional airline, which is Porter Airlines, to come in. Porter built a new terminal. They started operating more scheduled flights. And so the idea, unlike Edmonton, where we closed our city center airport and consolidated everything at the international, was, okay, well, let's actually invest in the city center airport and make it a viable airport. So Porter built a new terminal, and Porter Airlines started petitioning the government to re-examine the issue of banning jet travel, and they wanted a major expansion of the airport. But when the new federal government came in 2015, the $1 billion price tag for this expansion was way too much, and it got quashed. So as a result, jets are still no longer allowed at City Center Airport, and Porter Airlines expansion plans were pretty much nixed. I'm going to only cover this one briefly, but if you're familiar with Microsoft Flight Simulator, you'll probably recognize this airport. This is Chicago and Meigs Field. And in 1994, Mayor Daley announced plans to close the airport and build a park in its place. This airport meant a lot to people in Chicago, meant a lot to businesses in downtown. And the idea of closing this airport was particularly controversial. So the city briefly closed the airport. The lease expired in 1996. And then in 1997, there was a lot of pressure for them to reopen the airport. They reached a compromise in 2001 between Chicago, the state of Illinois, and others, essentially to keep the airport open for another 25 years. So things looked great for the airport. But it needed some key pieces of legislation to pass, and a particular legislation didn't pass through the United States Senate. So in 2003, Mayor Daley just hired a bunch of construction crews to come in overnight, and they just chewed up the runway with bulldozers and just destroyed the airport, essentially in the middle of the night without really any public consultation. So at least in Edmonton, we had plebiscites and proper debate as to whether or not to close the airport. Whereas in Chicago, the mayor just came in and just bulldozed and destroyed the runway overnight. They didn't even have a demolition notice. It was very, very not above board. So as I mentioned, in Edmonton was really losing the airport battle to Calgary. But there's a lot of factors that play into why Edmonton was losing this battle. Calgary is a little bit closer to the United States, which helps it a lot. And the airport is just generally is in a better location than the one in Edmonton. So here's Calgary. Here's the airport. You can see it's located within the city. Obviously, Calgary is very stretched out north to south, but the airport is relatively convenient. In Edmonton, obviously, here's the city center airport, and here's the international airport. So it's pretty inconvenient to get to. It's a 45-minute drive. For a long time, we had no public transportation there. Taxi's expensive. And if you look up here, you'll see another big airport. So this is Nemeo. And for a while, there was the idea to actually turn Nemeo into a passenger service. Obviously, this is a modern satellite photo, so when the idea was was being developed, Nemeo was a little bit further away from Edmonton than it appears now. But realistically, Nemeo probably would have been a better choice because it is much closer to the city and just a much more convenient airport. So in that 1995 plebiscite, Edmonton voted to consolidate air passenger service at the International, and that consolidation took place in 1996. Generally, a lot of people that were on the yes side of things and wanting to consolidate air passenger service felt that the frequency of Edmonton to Calgary service was really just funneling passengers to Calgary and helping Calgary to develop more and more of their international service. So if you cut off that Edmonton to Calgary link, the thought was going, then we could have more and more international flights from Edmonton. Didn't quite work out that way. There's a lot of editorials. If you go back through the journals at the time, obviously there's tons and tons of editorials that are written, letters to the editor. And so the general idea is like, oh, this is going to fix everything. Edmonton is going to regain all of this traffic that's been lost to Calgary. And it's going to be a really quick turnaround, and Edmonton's airport is going to take off. So the inconvenience of getting to the airport, which was often cited in the Montreal and Toronto debates, became a big factor here. So the people that wanted to keep the airport open obviously looked at the inconvenience of getting to the international airport. All of the businesses that were here at the city center airport, either servicing aircraft, running general aviation services, charter flights, flight training. It was much more convenient for them to be at the city center airport. So in a non-binding vote, 77% of Edmontonians voted to shut down scheduled traffic at the municipal airport, concentrated at the international. But they also voted to keep the downtown airport open at the time. So it wasn't a complete closure, just moving all of the scheduled service there. So this plebiscite allowed for 10-seater aircraft, the maximum of 10-seat aircraft, and nothing larger. So you could fly in a larger aircraft, but you couldn't have more than 10 passengers for passenger service. But you could fly in larger aircraft for maintenance. So we had Spar Aerospace that serviced Hercules aircraft, 737s, that kind of thing. So, as I said, the idea was to make the international airport more attractive. But it didn't really make anybody happy either way. The people that were really, really wanting everything to be consolidated weren't happy, and the people that wanted to invest in the Muni weren't happy. So it led to a long, bitter debate over the next 10, 15 years. So, of course, 1995, Canadian Airlines is still around, and they're not in favor of the decision. So they're running scheduled service out of the municipal airport. Obviously, it's going to have a big impact on their operations. But Edmonton Regional Airport Authority is pretty convinced that they're going to be able to make the international airports, or sorry, the municipal airport and the international airport both sustainable in their new forms. So they think there's going to be enough general aviation and enough corporate travel at the municipal to make it viable, and enough at the international airport to make it viable. But of course, even after this passes, there's just continued debate as to whether or not anybody achieved their goal. And this is when a lot of debate starts happening and a lot of editorials start happening about maybe there's a better use for the 540 acres here at the City Center Airport. So there's even immediately after this vote, there's a continued push from a lot of people to completely close the municipal airport and repurpose the land for something else. Air Canada, of course, completely in favor of consolidating everything at the international airport and completely closing the Muni. But of course, they're not operating from the municipal airport, so they're a little bit biased. Brian Mason has a lot of pretty good editorials from the mid-90s. He was pretty strongly in favor, or he was pretty strongly of the opinion that the municipal airport was being actively sabotaged, and that the Edmonton Regional Airports was essentially lying to the public by pretending that things were rosy. So in the mid-90s, they closed 4 hangars and they kicked 26 tenants out in order to, what they would say is, consolidate airport operations and save money. So publicly, they're saying, don't worry, we're going to have this airport flourishing in no time. But after 10 months after the passenger services leaves, you start having a lot of they start closing a lot of hangars, and they start kicking people out, and they start shutting up operations. So a lot of the local businesses feel that it's going to be kind of a death of 1,000 cuts. So they're going to do as many small things as possible to make life a living hell for everybody at the airport, make things not viable, so that eventually the decision has to be made to close the airport because it's not working out. But things actually start to get rosier for the City Center Airport. And they bounce back. There's more than 60 active businesses that are located at the airport. They're employing hundreds of people. And general aviation passenger traffic bounces back up by about 12% in 1997 compared to 1996. So for the people that really want to close the airport and that are wanting to do this death by 1,000 cuts, it kind of ends up backfiring on them. There's also, at the time, a growth in commuter traffic that was generally not entirely anticipated. So there's a lot more people flying smaller aircraft into the city center airports, both here in Edmonton and elsewhere. So this idea of closing downtown airports in the mid-90s starts to look a lot less attractive because a lot more people start using them compared to earlier in the 90s, when this debate really started picking up. So in 1999, the small carriers here at the City Center Airport petitioned the Edmonton airports to modify that 10-passenger access policy. They figured the 10-passenger aircraft seating capacity was too small, and they wanted to bump that up. And they wanted more flexibility in what kind of aircraft they could operate, because, of course, if they're only operating out of City Center Airport, that's one thing. But if they're operating out of many airports, they don't want to be entirely restricted by what can actually operate from here. So Edmonton Airports agrees to modify the policy at the time to allow 19-seat aircraft to be utilized, but they keep the restriction that only 10 passengers are to be carried from here. So it's a bit of a compromise. You're not able to fill the aircraft, but you're able to operate larger aircraft out of the airport. It helps, but obviously if they'd change that to allow these airlines to be able to carry a full passenger load, it would have been much, much better for their businesses, because flying an empty aircraft and half empty aircraft is a lot less profitable than flying a full one. In 1999, Edmonton Airports proposes to rezone about 45 hectares of the municipal, and this starts setting off alarm bells for people here at the airport. They immediately, go to the press and say that any attempt to rezone any part of the airport is obviously going to be a slippery slope, a building snowball, and is essentially just the start of closing down the airport. That same year, Edmonton funds a $131 million new terminal at the International as part of a $300 million expansion. And, this really signals that the city is much more interested in investing in the International Airport compared to the Municipal Airport. So the idea is that, of course, in order to make the International a viable airport and expand it for international service, as well as consolidate all of that smaller air traffic, they need to expand the International Airport. So it's financed by the Royal Bank, and it really kind of signaled at the time that I guess the writing was on the wall for City Center Airport. With the city focusing on investing so much money in the International, there really wasn't a lot left over for the Municipal. So in 2000, the Edmonton Regional Airport Authority took a huge bank loan out to finance this new terminal. And in that loan, as part of the agreement, the city of Edmonton had to promise that they would not bring scheduled service back to the downtown airport. So as part of that loan, really codified that kind of the International or the Municipal would not really be able to recover back to its glory days. 2001, there's more and more calls to rezone part of the airport and start closing it piecemeal. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not that 570 hectares could be used for something better. And there's more and more politicians that start getting on board with this idea of closing the airport permanently and redeveloping the area. So that grassroots campaign really kicks off, and a lot of the business owners here at the airport really start ramping up efforts to go public and really fight to keep the airport open. A lot of people were feeling that developers had too much say in city politics, and that the decision to close the airport was really driven by developers influencing politicians because they wanted valuable land close to downtown, and the economic benefits of turning the airport into something other than an airport really benefited the people that would be purchasing that land for cheap and not benefiting the city itself. Others, of course, would point out that the airport was restricting growth downtown. So the height of buildings downtown was restricted by the airport. So they argued that by closing the downtown airport, downtown itself would actually be able to, build taller buildings and be able to expand a lot more. And that idea of revitalizing downtown was a very hot topic at the time. And a lot of people were trying to figure out a way of making downtown a lot more vibrant. So, in spite of all this, there was a lot more regional and charter flights that were coming into Edmonton City Center Airport, despite the efforts to shift everything to the International. So there was a request for $18 million in improvements, but the only way that the Edmonton Airport Authority would be able to do that is pull it out of the International improvements. So with this request of pulling the money away from the International Airport, it becomes a huge problem for the Edmonton Airport Authority. They don't want to do it. They don't want to put any money into the municipal airport if they don't have to. But for the people at the municipal airport, they're really trying to make things work, but they often are working with one hand tied behind their back. They're not able to operate the aircraft that they would want to, or they're not able to fill up the aircraft, that they would want to. And the city is making it more and more like harder and harder for businesses to operate at the city center airport. So in a lot of ways, they kind of, even though the airport proved successful and a lot of businesses are making it work, with the restrictions that they put in, they are kind of forcing the issue and forcing the airport to look less viable and making it seem that closing the airport was really the only viable solution. So this debate about, reopening passenger service at the municipal airport or city center airport was really strongly encouraged. But ultimately, it was essentially all for naught. And the developers got their way. If you are, of the view that the developers have too much say in city politics, the developers got their way. There was a lot of calls to redevelop the land. They could build community housing. They could build essentially an urban village. And of course, lost in that debate was, not just what happens to all of the corporate jets that fly in and out of the international airport, what happens to all the private aircraft, but there was, real concerns over air ambulance services. Air ambulance operated out of the municipal airport, and it's obviously very close to hospitals. The city center airport had a huge history. It was the first licensed municipal airport in Canada. We had the Mercy's flight leave from here. We had huge operations in the Second World War, and a lot of people that had completely not tied up their lives, but really built their lives around the airport, and not for building an airport as an airport, but for making it, building up the city itself. So they were feeling pretty stabbed in the back. The air ambulance issue became a really hot topic, and a lot of people were extremely mad over the idea of closing the city center airport because of this loss of air ambulance services. But eventually, City Council voted to implement a phased closure of the city center airport. It passed with a vote of 10-3. So a lot of people blame, let's say, one particular mayor or one particular councillor at the time who later became a mayor. But, it was 10-3. There was a lot of people that voted yes for it, not just one particular mayor. So 2009, they voted for this staged closure of the airport. So runway 1634, which is the north-south runway, closed in 2010. There was a huge grassroots campaign by Envision Edmonton at the time to keep it open, but the writing was on the wall, and they started the staged shutdown of the airport. So they built the new 3,600 square meter air ambulance facility at the international airport, and they relocated the medevac services there. They voted in June to expropriate interests in the airport lands. So there's more than 200 landowners here at the airport. So they needed to start buying people out of their hangars, their businesses. A lot of those people, signed non-disclosure agreements, so we don't know exactly what the city paid for them. But I've heard various figures. Some say really, really not a lot, and some say a decent amount. So who knows? I don't have any figures. As part of this, though, to support general aviation, they announced that they would be expanding the Villeneuve Airport. So they announced they would build 6 new hangars at Villeneuve, extend one runway to 5,000 feet, install instrument landing system, improve stormwater, domestic water, sanitation systems. And then the Alberta Aviation Museum announced that they would be building a Alberta Flying Heritage Museum to be built at the Villeneuve Airport, which, of course, if you've been to the Villeneuve Airport, doesn't exist. So At the time, the 737 that had been in exhibit here at the airport since 2005 was fixed up and flown to Villeneuve as part of this effort to build a new build a new museum at Villeneuve. Of course, the plans were announced to redevelop the entire area into a home for about 30,000 residents, about 11,000 jobs. The idea was to transform City Center Airport into this vibrant neighborhood, increase density in the city, make use of existing infrastructure. But if you've driven by the airport lately, you can see that in the last 10 years, they haven't made a lot of progress, unfortunately. There was a big last-ditch effort by a string of business owners here, like Morningstar. They launched a series of lawsuits to prevent the closure, but the city said by November 15th, 2013, everybody had to be out. So they started expropriating everybody out of here. The International, since 2013, has attracted over $1 billion in private investment. It's becoming essentially a city in its own right, like an airport city. There's a lot of new partners that are building on the airport lands. So they have been expanding the international airport significantly, and passenger service was picking up quite a bit at the international airport. Obviously, with COVID, things are a little bit in the air. So as I mentioned, the 737 is at Villeneuve. When we posted this online, it led to a lot of debate. I wasn't in the museum. I wasn't a member of the museum in 2013 when this happened. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But the executive director that was here at the time is no longer here, so I'm not able to ask him directly. But I've heard that the city said that it was hanging over the property line and it would be destroyed if it wasn't moved. It was claimed at the time that we didn't have room on the property for the 737 and we needed to get it out of here. If you look at old satellite photos, when the 737 first came to the museum, it totally fits on the property line and it can easily park out back. When Air Canada donated the aircraft, they donated it with a specific provision that it never be flown again. So we rather cheekily fixed it up and flew it to Villeneuve, and it's now parked in the field. So the idea of building a new museum out at Villeneuve was quashed pretty quickly thereafter because we realized that we wouldn't be able to operate two museums effectively. This museum downtown, it's close to transit, it's at the historic airport, it's in a historic hangar, so really we belong here. Of course, the runways no longer exist, so getting the 737 back here is not exactly an easy task. We were looking at options of doing that before COVID hit, and then COVID hit and everything was a mess. If that's the case, there's a company in Australia that recently converted a couple of 737-200s into Airbnbs. So they removed the wings outside of the engines, towed the aircraft a couple hundred kilometers, and put the wings back on. And I talked to them about the process of removing the wings and putting them back on, and it sounds like a horrible nightmare. Because essentially you need to cut your way into the fuel tanks and work from inside the fuel tanks. All of the bolts are covered by a really, really thick rubber that is resistant to solvents. So they said, essentially, don't do it. The only real way to get this aircraft back to the airport, to the museum here, is to cut the wings off, bring the airplane back, and then mock up a way of reattaching the wings. Obviously, it's never going to fly again, but it's not supposed to fly again anyway. So when things settle down with COVID, we might relook at that. But the Villeneuve Airport Authority is also very interested in this aircraft. And rather than park it in a farmer's field where it's going to rot away, we're looking at a way of putting it on display at Villeneuve, like on a proper concrete pad in a good location so that it's accessible and visible and that we can take care of it a lot better. So a lot of people are very invested in this aircraft, and obviously the decision to fly it to Villeneuve and park it in a farmer's field was not a good decision. So it's something we're working on and trying to figure out a way of taking care of this aircraft better. if you were there that day, this is footage of the 737. Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So this particular 737 was a Pacific Western Airlines 737 that operated as an Airbus aircraft for the PWA Airbus. Later with Canadian Airlines and then Air Canada. So Air Canada, at the end of its life, donated it back to donated here and repainted it as a PWA aircraft. Sorry. So yeah, we got a special permit to fly it from here to Villeneuve. Gear was down the whole way. And yeah, unfortunately, we were told not to fly this aircraft ever again when it was donated to Air Canada, but it happened. And of course, that effort was really thanks to a lot of volunteers here at the airport that were former PWA 737 mechanics. In happier news, since consolidation, we have a new airline, a new low-cost airline headquartered here in Edmonton, which is Flair Airlines, and its main hub is at the Edmonton International Airport. So Flair offers scheduled domestic services to Canada, United States, and some internationally. Obviously, the 737 MAX order mess is going to hurt them significantly, as well as COVID. So we'll see what happens with Flair. But things are looking somewhat better for service at the international airport. This is a graph of passenger service at Edmonton and Calgary since 1963. So it's just an animated version of the graph that I showed earlier. You can see in 1963, things are pretty even. I made this animation a little bit too slowly. And skip ahead a little bit. But yeah, you can see that Calgary is rapidly outpacing Edmonton. It's still outpacing Edmonton. The airport closes. Edmonton dips, picks back up, drops a little bit, and then that's COVID. So we'll see what happens after COVID. And obviously I made this graph last year when I was teaching this course to a different group of people, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens after COVID. So you could probably teach a 12-hour course just on the airport debate alone. I know a lot of people are really passionate about that topic and had a lot of things tied up in it. For me, the very brief period of time that I did not live in Edmonton was around the time of the airport closure debate. So I missed a lot of this kind of firsthand and moved back to Edmonton in 2012 just as the airport essentially was, just as they voted to fully close it. But, you know, if you have any questions or you want to chat about it, I'm happy to hang out. Feel free to take yourself off mute. I'll pull up the chat to see if anybody typed anything.
Right, can you hear me?
Yep.
It's the first time I've been on one of these, so I got the invitation and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed all the hard work you put into it, and it brought back a lot of memories. I flew out of Aero Aviation, so your timelines and stuff were really interesting just to hear. I lived in the St. Albert, Morinville area for quite a while, and I still have a house in Morinville. I'm living in Northern Ontario now, taking care of my mother, 91 years old. So,
oh yeah,
kind of so far removed from all that. But you know, I'm still in contact. Last time I flew literally was decades ago, but my instructor was Bob Mikulak, who was flying with Cathay Pacific. He's now retired. I was talking to him just a few days ago, actually, which is really, really nice to know that he's still in my life. But brought back some great memories, Villeneuve in particular, and the Edmonton City Center, Blanchard Field. Got some interesting connections to that. But thank you. That was It was awesome.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for that.
Ed, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just I'd like to echo what that gentleman just said. I really enjoyed your presentation. A great factual overview of the whole saga, the whole debate. I would add that I think your last graphic that you had at the end there that basically showed there was no, Edmonton actually fell farther behind Calgary.
Yeah.
Post consolidation.
Yeah.
And I was one of the people involved in the 92 and the 95 referendums to keep the place open. And we argued all along that no matter how many airports you have, it's all dependent upon your traffic levels. And whether you have one airport or two airports, it's not going to change your traffic levels. And I think your graphic at the end nicely illustrated that point, that there was no, it was basically a fantasy that they were selling, that closing the downtown airport was going to increase traffic levels and indeed bring more international service. As a matter of fact, Edmonton lost international service post 1996, post consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
Canadian used to fly to Frankfurt and Gatwick and Tokyo, and that all disappeared post consolidation. And for the longest time, we had no international flights. So it was a fantasy that was perpetuated by property developers. Let's say an Air Force general who thought he could order airlines to fly into communities and lose money financially, that had no business sense whatsoever. So it's very sad. The poor citizens of Edmonton got taken for a ride.
Yeah.
I'd also add another comment, and I think Ryan, you probably know that, but I'm in the instrument flight procedure business.
Yep.
I'm very familiar with airport zoning and whatnot as it pertains to instrument flight procedures. And there is a notion and a rumor and a sort of I wouldn't call it old wives' tale, but a thought around that the Edmonton City Center Airport prevented development in downtown Edmonton. And as a guy who's very familiar with the various standards from Transport Canada involved in that, it's simply not true. Where you see the tall buildings today in downtown Edmonton could have been built even with the city center airport in existence.
Right. Yeah, because
there was a height restriction, but that was a city bylaw. That was a self-imposed wound upon Edmonton that was not necessary. And of course, once the airport closed, they rescinded that bylaw and buildings were built higher. But those same buildings could have been built with the Edmonton City Center Airport present. As a matter of fact, the proof of the pudding is, and you had a graphic earlier with the Toronto Billy Bishop Airport.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that at one time, the tallest man-made structure in the world, the Toronto CN Tower, is like 3 kilometers away from the Billy Bishop Airport. So the CN Tower is closer to the Billy Bishop Airport than downtown Edmonton was to the city center airport. So that puts the lie to that notion that Edmonton's development was frustrated by the presence of the downtown airport.
If I can make a comment, just to, and Ed, that's awesome. I mean, that's really, because I can understand where you're coming from with that. But to put my experience was, I used to work with Texaco Canada on 112th Street, just south of Jasper, or just north of Jasper, literally just one block north of Jasper. And one of the reasons I really fell in love with the idea of getting a pilot's license and getting my flying license out of Villeneuve actually came out of the fact that I used to have a lot of small planes coming down fairly low, right down 112th Street, literally right over the building. And I'll be honest with you, it was actually pretty exciting to have that. But I understand your point, though. I mean, there's always ways of dealing with that. But it was just it was an awesome experience to have them that close, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, if you want to tell war stories, I remember growing up as a kid when I was in my teens and taking the city bus from West Edmonton, where I grew up, to the city center airport to watch PWA 737s land and take off all day.
And when I was born in Toronto, and I lived in West Toronto. And I was maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. That would be 1967, 68. I used to ride my bike from Silverthorne Avenue and Rogers Road area out to Malton.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was about 45 minutes by bike because there wasn't any real development at that time. But same type of thing, and it was just a real love of being able to do that and watch those big planes come in.
Yeah.
So Ed, I just have a question for you. I've only ever flown a Cessna 152 into City Center Airport, so I'm not very familiar with the ILS approach. But if you're in a 737 coming into runway 34, like, what part of downtown are you flying over, and at what height?
Well, you're basically, as Sean mentioned a second ago, basically flying over about 112th Street.
Okay.
You know, you're about 3 blocks west of 109th.
Yeah.
So basically right down 112th Street. And you know where the Pearl Tower is now.
Yep.
You know, just south of Jasper there. That would be under the flight path landing. Well, it wouldn't be directly under the flight path, but it would be under. It'd be close to the flight path, but well below the protected surfaces of the ILS in the city center for the city center airport. But yeah, it would it'd be mostly low rise structures.
Yeah.
All the way down there. Yeah. You know, it's interesting to note that even with that airport open, the Epcot Tower, which is on the approach end of runway 30, that was constructed with the downtown airport still open.
Yeah.
And even with the height restriction. So it just goes to show you that buildings could have been built with high towers, even with the presence of the airport.
And there's obviously lots of other airports in the world that are surrounded by fairly tall buildings. Did you ever fly into Kai-Tak?
I never did do no. But yeah, you Edmonton was a piece of cake, you know, compared to a lot of other, you know, a lot of other places. Well, New York, LaGuardia, for example, would be one. Downtown Montreal is not that far away from Dorval. It would be another. So there's all sorts of examples, and you know, one of the parts of the debate, one of the challenges in the debate was a very myopic Edmonton Airport Authority. They didn't really know what went on in the rest of the world. Actually, no. Here's a classic one: London City Airport, right off the end of the dockyard, the Docklands. I mean, there are massive buildings at the London City Airport, which are way more challenging than anything that was ever at the Edmonton City Center Airport. But anyways, one of the frustrations in the whole debate was the airport authority didn't want to look outside or past the end of their own nose to see what was going on in the rest of the world. And it is interesting to note in the rest of the world, cities that have downtown airports are developing and expanding the use of downtown airports. Partly because of market demand, but also partly because aircraft are more capable now than they ever were. For example, you could easily have a Dash 8-400 do Edmonton City Center to Vancouver in probably within about 5 or 6 minutes of a jet doing that flight.
Yeah.
And you know, there'd be all sorts of possibilities of a downtown airport, but you know, the airport authority, if you want to call them authority, I think that's a misnomer, but they didn't want to tell that side of the story because that didn't support the case.
Oh, thanks for the insights.
Yeah. Just one other quick one.
Yeah.
When they wanted to close the downtown airport, when the CEO of the Edmonton airports at the time, his name was Reg Milley, he went before Edmonton City Council arguing to close the downtown airport completely, claiming that NAIT wanted to use some of the land west of where NAIT exists today, where the hangar line is, where the current hangars are.
Yeah.
And went in front of City Council and told them all this stuff. Well, next day, the president of NAIT, I think Sam Shaw was his name, or something like that. He's in the newspaper saying we have absolutely no plans of expanding west. Yeah, and here we are in 2022 or 23 now, and NAIT has never expanded west of their current or their property that was in existence at that time. It was bullshit. It was a well, it was a comment designed to scare city council into a decision which was not based upon any fact.
That's a shame, you know, having Nate that close was actually awesome for me. It just gave us a whole different perspective on the airport, you know, and the history it's played and the things that surrounded it were just made it very exciting as far as I was concerned. And that was so much a political decision. It was very disappointing that way.
Yeah. Well, I'll add another dimension to this, and that is, you know, they wanted to close the downtown airport to improve the economic plight of Edmonton, which, you know, is an interesting theory. When businesses come to cities and bring jobs and economic activity, they have press conferences. When businesses leave cities, they quietly pack up and move. And there's lots of businesses, especially in downtown Edmonton, that either moved entirely or moved a large part of their, particularly their executive group, south to Calgary because they can no longer travel between the two locations conveniently. There was no press conferences, no big announcements, but they just quietly slipped away in the middle of the night, and you don't hear about it, but you can certainly see the effect. I mean, post consolidation, and even today, I mean, even without COVID, downtown Edmonton's a ghost town.
Mm-hmm.
Probably afraid of all the repercussion anyway, Ed. Hey, you never know who's going to be stabbing your business in the back if you start talking against the bigger power.
Well, that's true, and certainly politicians come and go. CEOs of airport authorities have come and go, so they can inflict whatever damage, and they're never ultimately held accountable. It never comes out of their back pocket.
Look, thank you all very much. I have to beg out, but thank you very much. It was awesome.
Thanks.
Appreciate all your help, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, be overly familiar with the passenger statistics in Calgary. I mean, you're able to count the Edmonton passengers twice, once as they get off, once as they get on, or as they're coming back from their travel destinations to connect through Calgary. And I often joke with even the Edmonton Airport Authority, the best way to increase passenger traffic at the Edmonton International Airport was to have the RCMP enforce the speed limit on Highway 2. You know, make that drive an extra half hour painful, and your passenger stats would go up considerably.
Yeah. Well, you worked for those clowns for a while, didn't you? No, you worked for the Calgary Airport Authority.
Both. Yeah.
Oh, both? Yeah. By the way, I like your sweatshirt.
Thanks. It's vintage now, right?
Yeah. Collector's item. I saw somebody post a comment. They're asking me to document something.
Hi, David here. Yes, all those businesses that packed up and moved to Calgary, if you've got names, probably a good idea to make a list and hand it to Ryan for the archives.
Well, okay. Well, I know that ATCO packed up a large part of their operation, as an example.
Well, Shaw was the biggest one, right, with the previously owned capital or headquartered down on Whitemud and picked up and moved.
Yeah.
Or the Global Group.
Yeah. Those would be a couple off the top of my head. Yeah. But like I say, they don't have press conferences to announce them packing up and leaving. That's part of the problem. You have to hear this through other sources. Individuals that that have moved to Calgary, as an example. That's about the only way you ever find out. Oh, there's no
One of my favorite stories, I covered the entire debate over 2 plebiscites, 3 votes at City Hall. And I can't think of what it was. It was one of the, they hired these consultants, and one of the consultants was from Boston. And she used to talk about the city center airport. And every time she said it, it was like 4 syllables instead of 2. And it used to it still sticks in my mind when she used to talk about the city center port.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it
Well,
was a lot of debate.
well, if you recall, this thing actually started in about 1991 and 92. They had the Edmonton Air Services Commission, and they hired
Edmonton Air Services Authority.
authority. That's right.
Yeah.
Again, very generous use of the word authority, but they hired a consultant by the name of Ted Shetson.
Yep.
And Shetson wrote a paper, and he was told what to write, basically, claiming that there was all this leakage from Edmonton to Calgary, and if you close the downtown airport, all great things would happen. And it was BS right from the word go. And as it turns out, at that time, and one of the reasons why I got involved in this whole thing is I was a pilot with Canadian Airlines, and we would have access to the passenger load numbers going from, let's say, from the Muni to Calgary, and it would also show how many people are connecting to London or Frankfurt or whatever the case may be. And you couldn't even fill a Greyhound bus with the number of people that were flying from Edmonton to Calgary to connect in Calgary to go overseas. So the notion of severing the link between Edmonton and Calgary to somehow bring new flights to Edmonton, it was not based upon any factual passenger numbers. And I tried to get Dennis Harisiuk at the Edmonton Journal to bite on this story, but I think there were business interests that they advertised with the Edmonton Journal, PCL, for example, and a bunch of others. And I hate to think that a journalist would be influenced by corporate interests, but
It wouldn't be. Not those guys.
Don't think so?
I know all these people. No.
You don't
I
think
that's an unfair comment.
Okay, what would you maybe not the writer itself, but the editor that sets the
Editor, complete separation between editorial and advertising, and the Journal maintained that for a long time.
Okay, well, okay, fair enough. I'll take that back. I'll take that back in that case. But the point is that the numbers that they were claiming, that Ted Shetson was claiming in his report, that were filtering into Calgary to go overseas, were not large. They were definitely not very large, and certainly, and we saw that, of course, post consolidation.
But that was the report for the plebiscite that got voted down, right? That was the first plebiscite.
That's right.
The Shetson report was the plebiscite that got nixed.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, it's if you look at it that way, that report didn't obviously hold enough water for people to vote on it.
Well, no, you're right, and there was a better the Stanford University, the Edmonton Business Group, not the people that supported the community, but the ATCOs, the big businesses in downtown sponsored Stanford to come up and study this issue, and they produced a report that basically said you can close the airport all you want, but it's not going to change the outcome. And that was actually one of the best reports that was written in that whole era. And it was completely independently sponsored. It wasn't sponsored by the Pro Keep the Airport group. It wasn't sponsored by the airport authority that wanted to close it. It was independently funded, and it was one of the best studies done on this issue. The other interesting facet now is that there's now, if you look at the departure board at the Edmonton International Airport, there's now more flights and more seats to Calgary than ever before. So it wasn't, they did not accomplish what they were intending to accomplish.
Maybe we should just.
It keeps the debate raging.
Yeah, it does. And every so often I write something to the Edmonton Journal, and the only thing I think I tell my kids is, if someone's promising you the world, you should probably think very carefully whether there's any validity to it or not. And the Edmonton Airport Authority was promising the world to to the Edmonton voters if they chose to close the downtown airport.
And I wouldn't be the first politicians who'd be wrong.
No, that's true. That's true. You know,
Or
Ryan,
the last.
you know, there's another angle to this too, Ryan, by the way, and that is after the 92 referendum was won by the Keep the Downtown Airport side, even though and of course the drums continue to beat to close the downtown airport, and almost much like the Quebec referendum, if you don't get the answer you want the first time, i.e. the 92 referendum or the 76 referendum in Quebec, you just keep asking the question over and over again until you get the answer you want. But anyways, there were, and Rick Coblin was involved with this, there were meetings with the military to look at the idea of consolidating everything at Namao, as you mentioned in your talk, the Mayo Airport being close by there. And actually it had, from what I was told, the government of Alberta signed off on it because the Anthony Henday, of course, was planned to go near that airport, which it does now. And also it would not be a difficult extension to the LRT to, if you were to build a terminal building on the south side of the airport, build a brand new terminal with LRT access, that would take you right into downtown Edmonton. That was an option that was actually had a fair bit of traction with the military until a certain general in Winnipeg, who ultimately became the CEO of the Edmonton Airport Authority, nixed the idea.
Well, yeah, but that would have had to occur prior to '68 when the International was built, and at the time the U.S. military was still involved in the Mayo, right? So it could have been a Winnipeg type of airport where there was part military, part civilian traffic. It's perfect because it's on the north side of the river and you didn't have to worry about crossings. But yeah, it would also have to exclude the fact that whoever owned the land at the Edmonton International Airport didn't have a brother-in-law that was in Parliament.
Yeah, but this idea of moving everything to Namao actually sprung up in around 1993, 1994. Yeah.
And it was probably too late by that time, though. There was too much investment at the International for them to walk away from.
Well,
Yeah.
As well as when the International was built, like that, the idea was brought up when the International was built to maybe just use Namao instead.
In '68, when the choice was made, right? That's you would have had to have done it then, but the Cold War was still raging, and the U.S. military still had too much involvement in their fingers in the pie with the lease of the Namao.
Yeah.
Besides, there's something.
Your command base.
Wasn't there something about Bill Horlak's some family member owned the land somewhere, or
For the International?
yeah?
Yeah, it's heard many rumors, somebody having some, I mean, everybody would have owned the land, whichever site they had chosen in '67 when they chose to look at different locations. But yeah, there was probably some politics involved, no doubt, with the International being in Leduc.
Anyways, Ryan, great job for the whole year. We look forward to
Thanks.
the new year.
Enjoy the rest of your.
Thanks,
Yeah.
but yeah, thanks for getting my blood pressure up.
Good memories.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
bye-bye.
Have a good
All right,
night.
cheers.